It gives me great pleasure now to introduce our next speaker, Kate McCann, political editor at TalkTV, to talk us through the latest developments. And goodness, there are so many, aren't there? We might have one while we're on stage together from inside Westminster. Kate will be taking questions during this session, so please do send them in via Slido. The code is at the bottom of your screen. And for those watching online, you can use the Slido box in Hopin. So a warm welcome to Kate McCann. Please come on down.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. Thank you very much for having me, Nina. Thank you for that introduction. I'm delighted to be here in person. The last time I spoke to you was actually virtually during the COVID-19 pandemic, so it's lovely to see you all here today. Now, I have to admit that I've got written down here in front of me that I'm glad that I didn't write this speech over the weekend, but I feel like I might have to rewrite that even as I stand here now, because I've got my phone on stage in case Nadhim Zahawi quits or is sacked before Prime Minister's questions in just an hour or so. So everyone loves a bit of audience participation. Do put your hand up or shout if he is sacked during this speech, and we'll chuck the cards away. But it has been a pretty fraught couple of months, I have to say, including covering Boris Johnson's resignation while wearing workwear on top and pyjama bottoms on the bottom half, something to remember. But the past couple of months have really created two different camps of political journalists. There are those of us who are now pretty addicted to the sugar rush. We keep our phones on hand, look at when it flashes up with a notification, just in case something else has happened in the last 5 minutes. And there are those old hands who feel that they would quite like the royal correspondents to take a little bit of the weight off our shoulders, which they have for the last couple of weeks. So thank you very much for that. But I think it's very much back to the political roller coaster, as I was just saying there. I mean, there is so much going on in politics at the moment. And the last time I spoke to you, it was on Zoom. We were in the middle of a COVID-19 pandemic, and I had just been the birth partner for my friend, gone through something that I never thought I would go through, at least not from that perspective. And I was talking about political communications and the importance of being calm under pressure and how stressful situations need good political communications. Now, I have to say, the last year has been more panic-inducing as a political correspondent than that birth experience was. Some ministers have lasted a shorter time in that job than that whole childbirth period. So, yeah, quite a feat for some of those ministers. And I'm about to do it all over again. She's going to have another baby in a month's time. So fingers crossed it's just that roller coaster and not another prime ministerial resignation that we have to deal with. But you will all have been following what's been happening in politics over the last couple of months. I don't think Liz Truss and some in Westminster are ready to relive it quite yet. But something has stuck with me from that period of time, and I think it's going to be relevant for the next general election, so it's worth picking up on today. Because a bit like Liz Truss, I had my own dramatic downfall over the summer. I managed to faint on stage, well, in a TV studio, when I was in the middle of chairing a debate between Liz Truss and Rishi Sunak. Don't worry, organisers, I have jelly babies somewhere down there, just in case they're needed. Someone can run on stage with them. But it was one of those moments that obviously nobody wants it to happen to them. But it was the reaction to Liz Truss that really got me thinking. I don't know if you all remember, but there were all those front pages where Liz Truss kind of had her hands to her head and, looked incredibly shocked. And the thing that people kept saying to me after that was that she reacted like a human being. She reacted like a mother would. And I thought, of course that's odd. I mean, that's exactly how you would react if someone hits the deck in front of you. You don't really know what to do. It's a very difficult situation. But it struck a chord for me because what it tells you is about how important it is for politicians to really connect with people in that human way. And I think it's worth considering ahead of the next general election, because we've got two politicians in Westminster right now who have raised questions about whether they are personable, whether they're a little bit boring, whether that's a good or a bad thing, and how that might translate into votes. Which brings me to the two camps in Westminster right now. There are obviously many more than two, but for the purposes of this, let's say there are two. The 1992ers and the 1997ers. Now, the 1992 camp are convinced that the Tories can just about squeak a general election win, and that's because they believe their situation isn't as bad as everybody says it is, and that Labour's actually is probably worse than the polls show and some people have predicted. The suggestion is that Labour will lose the next election and that the Conservative Party will just about squeak it, largely because neither Keir Starmer or Rishi Sunak have got the country convinced. The country not really sure about either of them for slightly different reasons. And what that means for both of those men, in theory, is that they will underwhelm. And so the result will be a reduced majority for the Conservatives and a loss for the Labour Party. Now, why is this relevant to that human touch question? Well, I think it's the sniff test. Both men have been, at some point, called a bit boring. In fact, lots of us welcomed the return of boring politics. They've both got a really good grasp of policy in detail. They weigh up and make decisions like economists do. They think them through quite carefully. They've both climbed the political ladder, although not necessarily in Westminster, like some politicians do. But they've both been accused in the past, and in the very present for one of them, of poor political judgment. For Rishi Sunak, clearly, the accusation is that he's not made the right call in the Nadeem Zahawi situation. I can't see any hands up yet, so I assume we're still good to go. He's still in post. But for Keir Starmer, there have been questions too about Labour's relationship with women. I mean, just look at the Rosie Duffield situation and how that has gone down with the party and outside of it in the last week or so. Both are liked, but not necessarily fully trusted by those in their party. They have questions. So do they pass the sniff test? There are people in Westminster who will tell you that's very similar to what happened in 1992. I have to say, I wasn't actually covering politics then. I think I would be on a par with that little boy who joined Mensa at 2 if I were. But I have read a lot about it, of course, and neither John Major nor Neil Kinnock really enthused their parties or the country. There were some pretty big questions about their characters. And ultimately, they both underwhelmed. I mean, Kinnock had personality. There are lots of people who say that Labour's strategy in that election was very poor because they played that down in favour of making him into a very kind of boring statesman-like figure to counter some other questions about him. The Tories did snatch a victory. It wasn't a resounding one. And ultimately, the man who had spent quite a long time rebuilding the Labour Party left, somebody else took his place and won the next general election. And that is something that worries some Labour strategists about whether Keir Starmer has really done enough to convince people that he isn't in that same mould. It's also what keeps some Conservatives from quitting altogether because they believe there is a chance that they could potentially keep their seats. Now, Keir Starmer, the 1992 can't believe, can get out from under this so-called Kinnock curse. Think about the use of language. Labour are being more punchy than they have been before. Some of the language they're using is kind of Brexity. That's a really interesting move for that party, and they're defending it robustly. They'll continue to do that too. They're also picking fights with people you wouldn't maybe expect. There's some quite bold policy thinking now on the NHS. Watch West Streeting. That's a really fascinating thing to keep an eye on. And we're going to hear more about Keir Starmer's personality. I'm afraid we're going to hear more about his Pebble Dash semi, everybody, so prepare yourselves for that one. Rishi Sunak, of course, is still more trusted on the economy than the Labour Party. He's more popular than Boris Johnson was as Prime Minister. Some may find that hard to believe, but polling does still stack up for the former Prime Minister. And he has a clear set of aims that he wants to deliver, which, if the Prime Minister can do that, would mean he could hold up something to show those voters who lent the Tory party their votes last time round that the party can do what it says. But, and it's a huge but, there is still that whiff of chaos that surrounds the Conservative government right now. And it's what Lucy Powell was talking about in her speech. It's what concerns lots of Conservative MPs on the back benches. No matter how much, I was going to say links Africa, but whatever you want to insert there, Rishi Sunak sprays around to try and get rid of that smell. It is lingering, and it's really hard for him to do anything about it. He may want to project the idea of being a new government, but he isn't really. He's been in government for a long time. He's been there throughout Boris Johnson's time too. And there are big questions now about Simon Case and some of the other staff who were around at that point in time. Nadeem Zahawi is one of those issues that's brought that to the fore. But don't forget, there are other ministers too, like Dominic Raab, who's facing allegations of bullying, and MPs from all parties who are caught up in investigations. If you step back, and I'm sure all of you have asked this question, you will think, why on earth is Nadeem Zahawi still in post? Because eventually he probably will be sacked. That's the question lots of Tory MPs are asking too, and that's a problem for the Prime Minister. Now, Camp 2 are the 1997ers. These are more optimistic for the Labour Party. They think Labour can secure a resounding win, largely because of the economic situation we're in right now, the way that the country feels, the strikes, the fact that inflation is not in a good position. Now, some people will tell you that voters never opt for change when they don't feel financially secure, but COVID has changed the way things work, and could it change that too? I have to say, for Labour, I think there's still a mountain to climb in Scotland. Even though some suggest the SNP are weakened, Nicola Sturgeon is still a force to be reckoned with. And don't underestimate the power of the personal vote of those Conservatives in the North and the Midlands who took a long time convincing people that they were the right person and not necessarily the Conservative Party. It's going to be a difficult battle for Labour to win. Now, we could talk all day about the prospects of the next general election, and I haven't touched at all on things like Ukraine, on economic policy. I know lots of people will be interested in that. But I go back again to the reaction to what happened in the summer, to Liz Truss. Lots of people ask, how did Liz Truss get to be the Tory leader? Why did Conservative members vote for her? And I think so much of it came down to that human touch, to the way that people reacted when she showed a little bit of normality. And again, it becomes a problem for the two leaders we have in Westminster right now. They are both capable, but they both lack a little bit of sparkle that gets leaders traditionally over the line with a big majority in a general election. And voters prefer to stick rather than twist when they are not convinced. So could we be heading to a 1992 underwhelming result for both Keir Starmer and Rishi Sunak? We will, of course, have to wait and see. And I think I've made it through without a resignation. So good. Thank you.
I'm just getting you to Jeremy on the middle chair. Thank you very much for
Thank
that.
you.
And we'll keep our eye on the phone to see if anything changes while I'm chatting through these Slido questions. I think it's interesting that the biggest laugh, or the first laugh of the day, was the response to the words Nadine Dorries, and that really ties into the first question here from Nick Manning. Is personality now too dominant a requirement for politicians compared to good old-fashioned competence? We constantly are talking about personalities rather than government policies for good reason, because of all the accusations that are being levelled at the people in power right now. But we need to get back, for the good of the country, to talking about policies.
Yeah, and I think we are, and that's a really valuable question, particularly in the context of what I've just said about the human touch and the reason why that matters to voters. But I think policy does matter. The reality is, Labour and the Conservatives are not actually in too different a place on some of the main policies of the day. I mean, take strikes, for example, and the way that that is being tackled by both sides. I mean, both Keir Starmer and the Prime Minister have said, we need to be careful with the money. There's not a huge amount of money to make these big payouts. They've both recognised that the NHS is under strain, although the Prime Minister won't necessarily go as far as the Leader of the Opposition. I think when two leaders are very close on policy, personality does become more important. And that's not at the expense of good policy, but it is something that helps voters look at a politician and say, are you like me? Do I trust you? And do I feel like you're going to do a good job for my family? And for different reasons, I think Keir Starmer's had more time to get away from the idea that he's just a man in a suit, a bit of a grey man, a bit boring. And he's managed to move the conversation on to him being a bit more competent, which is why those policy interventions and that language matters. But Rishi Sunak hasn't had that chance. He's still relatively unknown to most people, and he's going to go into a general election like that. And so I think that makes it difficult for him, and it makes that personality question more important, because people don't yet really know what he sort of feels like as a leader.
And we may, I guess, have a choice between two cheese and pickle sandwiches that are pretty boring but stable and actually will fuel you. And that, given the roller coaster we've been on, might be the best choice for us right now. We'll wait and see. You touched on this a lot, but a question there, will Starmer be our next Prime Minister?
I think there are a lot of people in Westminster who will tell you that he will definitely be the next Prime Minister. I think the note of caution I would issue is there is a huge mountain to climb in Scotland, and not to underestimate that. And what's going on between the SNP and the parties in Westminster right now is very difficult for all of the parties involved for different reasons. But Labour has a huge amount of ground to reclaim. And without that, in Scotland, it will be very difficult for them to win a majority. Think about the North and the Midlands too. I mean, some of those seats that went Tory in the last election, they had been losing Labour votes in those areas since 1997. Some of those seats that were lost this time round, that decline had been, over a decade, which tells you that this is not just a recent problem, it's a fundamental question of where Labour's appeal is in those communities, and it will be hard to win that back quickly.
And a fundamental problem as well, there was a question here, how, again, you touched on the Scottish problem.
Yes.
How can Labour and Conservatives win the election with the SNP rise to power in Scotland?
What's happening with the SNP right now is really interesting, because I think there are those in Scotland who feel that Nicola Sturgeon has overplayed her hand in the current debate, which has obviously forced this issue with Westminster and the triggering of Section 35. Mm-hmm. That has drawn tension around this idea of how able is Scotland to govern itself. There is a sense that she has chosen the wrong issue, because polling doesn't necessarily support what Nicola Sturgeon is doing north of the border. And it is much more closely aligned to what Rishi Sunak and his government are actually saying. But for Labour politically to try and rebuild there, I'm just not convinced that enough groundwork has been done to show those results in time for the next general election, which is not to say they're not trying, and there is certainly an appeal, but I'm just not sure they're there yet.
And time is running out, isn't it? A question here from Christoph Baer. How will our relationship to Europe change, and what does this mean for talent for the creative industries, if you can answer that? Give it a go.
I mean, yeah, that's a cracking question. The Brexit issue. I mean, the relationship with the European Union is not going to change fundamentally from where we are now. I mean, nobody is promising a return going back into the EU. That's not going to happen. That's not on the cards. There are lots of unresolved issues, though, around the relationship between the UK and the European Union. And I don't think they're settled in any party. I think they're uncomfortable for Labour. And I sort of nodded to it in that speech just there about Labour using the language of Brexit, taking back control. That's deliberate. It's trying to tell people this is where we are, you can trust us. But, there are those questions about the flow of people, and Labour has had to address them head on. Talking about how, well, we shouldn't be staffing the NHS with people from overseas. Okay, but we have a huge staffing shortage and not enough people in this country to fill those jobs. So how do you fill that gap? It's much more difficult in government, and for the opposition it's not an immediate question, but it is a problem. And it's something that they are going to have to tackle. I think as we get closer it'll become more of an issue.
Kate, I want a positive answer to the next question. If you can't give me one, please just lie. Right, Joe Espinoza, I think that's correct, says, do you think there is a path back to boring politics, or are we forever in the cycle of scandal and abuse of power?
Really, really good question. I'll tell you something interesting about Number 10, where Number 10 are now. So Rishi Sunak has obviously come into power, and he's hired mostly a new team, and he's hired some really good comms professionals. And the one thing that they all said when they walked into Number 10 was, we need to stop the sugar rush. We have to stop this endless cycle of ministers going out on the morning round, answering questions, fueling a story, which then snowballs into something we can't control. So you may have noticed that you won't hear a senior minister on the Today programme at the 8:10 slot as much as you would have before. You don't always see senior ministers out on the Sunday shows, much to my frustration now. And that's for a reason. It's to slow this whole thing down and focus on policy. And what Number 10 is saying now is, when we have something that we want to talk about, we will gladly come out and talk about it. The problem that they've got is that this is not a new government. So they are coming in, they want to govern like a new government, but they're not. They have all of the hangovers and the problems of the previous administration. And we talked about Dominic Raab, Nadine Zahawi, the people that may or may not have known about those things, who remain in government and have now been for some time. So it's very difficult for Rishi Sunak to give that impression that everything has changed. But he does want to. I think both parties want to. They want to talk about the fundamentals, not least because NHS policy the NHS is in a dire situation, and it requires a fundamental overhaul, which is going to be difficult, expensive, and probably quite tedious for people who work within it. And that's going to take a lot of political will and bandwidth to get through.
That change you mentioned in terms of the media management, is that the greater transparency that Mr. Sunak
Interesting question, isn't it? And there are some of us who feel that doesn't satisfy the greater transparency. Their argument, Number 10's argument, is, well, we are being transparent about the policies that we are developing, and we're more than happy to answer questions on those. But what they don't want to do is have this endless stream of different ministers saying different things about the same issue, which then becomes a problem, and which they identified as some of the reasons why those former leaders were brought down.
Why is Brexit and its impact as an overall subject avoided by press and politicians?
I don't think it is it? Why is it avoided? Who's saying yes? Someone shout.
Because nobody seems to be offering any kind of reasoned analysis of the impact of Brexit. It's almost like the BBC, it's a murder. They don't really want to talk about it. For fear that it will be seen to be relitigating something that people have thought about. But every single independent and thoughtful economist and commentator knows that Brexit has completely undermined our economy in a very bad way. And I don't think that is brought to the fore with quite independent rigour that it should be by journalists such as yourself, BBC, ITV and Sky.
I mean, it's interesting, but then Times Radio did a huge feature yesterday morning on the... I mean, unfortunately, I cannot control the BBC as much as I'm not sure I would like to at the moment either, but I can't control the BBC. It's a really good question. I'm not going to deny there are lots of things that we don't focus on that we probably could focus more attention on. It is being done, but it's being done in quite niche ways in some situations. So, we're talking right now about export of particular goods, between GB and NI. That's a niche issue. For most people in the country, that is not an interesting conversation to have. And it's difficult because we're talking to a general audience a lot of the time, particularly political correspondents. We're not always talking to people who have an in-depth knowledge of how trade negotiations work, of why this is an issue in the first place, of how it can be solved. I think the barrier to entry with Brexit stories, and I'm being brutally honest with you now, I think the barrier to entry is often the reason why they are not talked about as much as they maybe ought to be. Because the knowledge that you need to really understand what's going on, I don't mean for us, because that's my job, I mean for people who listen to it, it can be prohibitive. And maybe that's a failure on our part to communicate it more clearly, or maybe it's because it is incredibly complicated. And to go back to the original question, when you talk about boring policy, yes, that may be what people want, but it's not very easy or exciting to communicate or listen to, or actually to get people interested in. Which I suppose is why, part of my job is to read a policy paper or watch a committee for 3 hours and try and identify the bit that I think will matter to most people, which is always a judgment call. And sometimes we don't get it right.
And just in response to that question as well, I'm not here to defend the BBC, but just in journalists in general, I know that Nikki Campbell, BBC Radio 5 Live, is hosting a whole debate on Brexit. Next week, I think. So I think you will see more of that, especially as the anniversary of one of the big milestones hit. That's on BBC Radio 5 Live. A question quite a few people want an answer to. What do you think the impact on the creative industries will be with a Conservative versus a Labour election? I presume they mean win.
When somebody wins.
Yeah.
I mean, I think you heard from those two political keynote speeches exactly where the priorities lie. It's sort of, maybe it's expected, but what you get from a Labour government and what you're getting from Labour politicians at the moment are potentially bigger ideas, things that may make bigger changes sound more exciting. That's the job of an opposition politician. It's very difficult for the government to make very big promises. I think there has been frustration in this sector that politicians have not got it, and I expect that's why there was a laugh when Nadine Dorries' name was mentioned just before, because there was a sense that this policy in this area has been going back and forth, and it hasn't really had a huge amount of focus in the Conservative government. And potentially that's because of everything else that they are trying to focus on at the moment. I mean, I have to say, it's not something, you will not want to hear this, it is not something that frequently comes up as top of the government's agenda. All politicians' agenda. There are some who are very focused on it, and online safety, of course, issues like that are very, very important. But in terms of, more broadly, it doesn't come up a huge amount.
Kate, we're running out of time. 2 quick fire questions. Yes. A question that won't go away. Can Boris Johnson come back as PM, and would it make any difference if he did?
Make any difference to whom?
Can he come back then, quick fire?
No, I don't think he can come back.
You don't think? And Zahawi, will he last the day, the week, the rest
All right, that's
of
not fair because I
the,
can't look at my phone, so I don't know.
We'll
And
allow you.
I've got,
What's your prediction, though?
I've got 14 WhatsApp messages. I might be bad. I think he will last today. I think it's very difficult to see how he continues after an investigation because of the reasons that we've all been talking about. But did he give the Prime Minister enough information before Rishi Sunak had to go into Prime Minister's questions? Was Simon Case aware? If so, why was the Prime Minister not aware? I think for the Tories, the problem is here. When you start opening that box and answering those questions, you put other people in the firing line, and that becomes increasingly more difficult.
Always comes back down to who knew what, where, and
Yes.
when. Kate McCann, a fabulous session. Thank you so much. We've got loads of questions. We've run out of time. Thank you so much for joining us. Really appreciate that. Thank you.